Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, Mr. Hochberg, I want to thank you for your leadership at the XM Bank. I want to go first in my questions back to the first question the chairman had and just explore it a little further. You talked with him about the fact that the number of bank transactions has increased from 2012 to 2013, and while the overall value of authorizations has actually decreased, and I appreciate your answer to his question about that. One question I have is, what effect does this dynamic have on small business transactions?
Well, small business is something that, one, I feel very close to, one, having run a small business and frankly served at the SBA under President Clinton. We are continually finding new ways to reach small businesses. We've modified our website. We've opened additional offices when we received an appropriation a few years ago. We're innovating new products. I mentioned the award we received from Harvard's Kennedy School about, it's a product called Express Insurance. We can turn around and give an answer within 5 working days of a request for insurance to insure overseas receivables. So we're continually finding, how do we chip away? How do we find better ways? The other thing, frankly, Senator, when we were out in Boise, meeting with exporters in your state and in many of the members of this committee, we had, I think we're at standing room only, I recall that. I think we had between 100, 120 people there who are looking for information, how they can export and secure their business and increase sales and thereby increase jobs at home.
Well, thank you, and we do appreciate your outreach on that. I want to turn to what appears to be a contraction of the medium-term program. In 2013, the medium-term program totaled only about $234 million, and when you compare that to a $27 billion portfolio, it's about 1%. And last year, the bank provided no medium-term loans, as I understand it. It further appears that the bank has allowed its medium-term program to contract while overall demand for bank support has increased. Why has the bank allowed the medium-term program to shrink when the overall demand for authorizations is consistently growing?
Well, let's recall that what we do at Exim Bank is fill in gaps that the private sector is not doing. So the private sector always gives small businesses a hard time. That will never change. It's getting better, but it will never change. And for long-term loans in remote parts of the world that require 12-year financing or longer, the private sector also has difficulty there. The medium-term market is one that banks actually fill well. I don't want to compete with the banks at all. It's not in our charter. We supplement the banks. We're not trying to replace them in any way whatsoever. So where the banks step in, we're happy to step back. We only want to step forward when we're really needed.
Do you have the same credit standards for the medium-term program as you do for other loan programs?
We do have the same standard. I have to tell you, though, when I arrived at Exim Bank in 2009, the default rate in the medium-term program was as high as 44%. We now have a default rate that we've brought down to 7%. You recall that Congress has a mandate that we have to keep overall defaults 2% or less. So we monitor our defaults and say, what do we need to do? We're not in the grant business, we're in the loan business. We need to get paid back. And frankly, a 44% default rate, I was in business for 20 years, was just unacceptable. We got it down to 7, and frankly, we need to still work that to a level that's acceptable by lending standards.
No, thank you. And the bank has co-financing agreements in place with 11 countries. These programs enable the bank to meet foreign competition by working cooperatively with foreign export credit agencies, largely to the benefit of the bank's largest exporters. The small and medium-sized enterprise exporting community has long sought such a program. Does the bank have a comparable program in supporting similar transactions among small and medium enterprises?
Without question. I'll give you one example. Dave Eichert from Olney, Texas, that sells crop dusters and firefighting planes, mostly to farmers. Most of their customers are in Latin America. We co-finance with Canada. The engines for those planes come in from Canada, supported by EDC, our counterpart in Canada, and we support the manufacture of the actual airplane itself. That's just one example. That's a medium-term loan. Another aircraft company called Thrush that sells a competing product in China. Also, those engines come from Czech Republic, and so we together jointly finance that so that those smaller and it's a medium-sized transaction, takes advantage of that.
Thank you. And lastly, on this round, With regard to XM's climate change guidelines, last December, the bank issued new environmental guidelines to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and almost immediately it became more difficult for developing countries to find public financing for coal-fired plants. Is the bank's guidance consistent with the bank's chartered mandate to provide competitive financing on behalf of U.S. exporters to find U.S. jobs? I guess the question really is, what is the intention of the bank with this new guidance, and how does that support the bank's objectives?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Senator. You know, our charter, which goes back to 1945, although the bank will celebrate 80 years this year, is celebrating 80 years this year, has laid out an environmental requirement in our charter back to 1992. So we have always had to balance supporting U.S. jobs and looking at the environmental impact of those jobs for over 22 years now. And we're constantly working with industry and environmental groups and finding that balance between the two. Sometimes I think we make everybody angry at us, both the exporter and the environmental community. Both of them would like us to tilt more in one direction or another, and we're trying to find that line in between that balances jobs and the environment and keeps that in some kind of balance.
Thank you.